The pile stood taller than the grain elevator behind it, a mountain of wet, shredded beet pulp steaming faintly in the cold October air, and it smelled like sour candy and mud. Trucks kept dumping more on top of it, all day, every day, for 6 weeks straight, because the sugar plant in Drayton, North Dakota, had no use for it and no room to keep it. A sign near the scale house, hand-lettered, read, "Free, take all you want." Nobody wanted it. That's the image worth sitting with. A mountain of processed food, still warm from the factory, that an entire town treated as garbage. The question is, why one 26-year-old woman with 40 cows and no money looked at that mountain and saw a paycheck instead of a problem. Her name was Mari Halverson, and she was from Pembina County in the Red River Valley, flat as a tabletop and black-soiled, the kind of ground that grows sugar beets better than almost anywhere else in the country. She'd grown up on her father's dairy, 70 cows, milked twice a day, the kind of operation that was already old-fashioned by the time she was in high school. She left for Fargo at 19 to study business, told herself she'd never smell a barn again. 6 years later, her father died of a stroke out by the silage pit, and she came home for the funeral and never quite left, because somebody had to feed the cows that week, and then the next week, and by spring she'd quietly stopped talking about going back. She was 26, running a herd that was too small to be efficient by any modern standard, with an operating loan that made her stomach hurt every time she thought about it, and a feed bill that ate almost everything the milk check brought in. Corn silage and alfalfa hay were the backbone of her ration, same as every dairy in the valley, and both had gotten expensive. A drought 2 summers running had pushed hay prices up by nearly 60%, and she was buying trucked-in corn because her own acreage wasn't enough. She was, by her own later description, about 8 months from selling the herd and renting out the land, when her neighbor Gary Iverson mentioned, almost as a joke, that the beet plant would pay you to haul pulp away. Wet beet pulp is what's left after a sugar plant slices beets and extracts the sucrose in hot water diffusers. The fiber, the pectin, the tiny bit of residual sugar, all of that stays behind as a wet, stringy byproduct, roughly 90% water, and there is a staggering amount of it. A plant processing beets at Drayton's scale could produce hundreds of tons of wet pulp a day during the fall campaign, which runs from September to about January. It has real feed value. It's high in digestible fiber, a decent energy source for cattle, and dairy nutritionists elsewhere in the country had been using dried or ensiled beet pulp for decades. But wet pulp spoils fast. It's heavy and expensive to truck any distance because it's mostly water, and most farmers in the valley simply didn't know what to do with it or didn't think it was worth the hassle. The plant would rather give it away than pay to landfill it. Everyone's assumption, stated plainly by half the county, it's factory garbage, wet trash, not real feed, and only a fool would build anything around something a plant couldn't even find a way to sell. Mari didn't set out to build a business. She set out to save $40 a day on corn. She borrowed her father's old manure spreader. No, actually, she borrowed a neighbor's dump trailer because pulp is too wet and stringy for a spreader, and hauled her first 3 loads home in late October, freezing her hands loading it with a skid steer bucket, thinking she'd just feed it fresh, a little bit a day, mixed into the ration. That worked for about 11 days. Then it didn't. The first failure was rot. She'd piled the extra pulp in a heap behind the barn, figuring she'd work through it over a couple of weeks, and she hadn't accounted for how fast wet organic material, with that much sugar and moisture, heats up and turns anaerobic in the middle of a pile. By day 12, the center of the heap was slimy, gray, and stank of butyric acid, a sharp, vomit-like smell that told her, before she even got close, that something had gone wrong with the fermentation. She fed a batch of it anyway, not thinking much of it, and 3 cows went off their feed for 2 days, and one had loose manure so bad she called the vet. The vet's diagnosis was simple: spoiled feed, likely some mold growth and a bad fermentation profile. Nothing that would kill a cow, but enough to tank milk production for a week. Lesson 1. You cannot just pile wet pulp and feed from it like a hay bale. It has to be managed as a fermentation process from the moment it hits the ground, or not stored loose at all. She went looking for someone who knew more than she did, and found him at the elevator, of all places, an old man named Elmer Sandvold, 78 years old, who had spent 31 years running the feed mill in Cavalier before it closed in the 90s, and who still showed up at the co-op most mornings out of habit rather than need. Elmer didn't say much. When Mari described what had happened, he was quiet for a long moment, looking at his coffee, and then said, "You're not storing pulp, you're making silage. Different thing entirely." That sentence didn't mean much to her yet. It would mean everything to her a year later. Elmer explained in his sparse way, over about 4 separate conversations that fall, that wet beet pulp needed to be ensiled properly if she wanted to keep it past a couple of weeks, packed tight, in a bunker or a bag, or under plastic, with the air excluded so that the right bacteria, the lactic acid-producing kind, could take over and drop the pH fast before the wrong bacteria, the Clostridia, the ones that produce butyric acid, got a foothold. "Get the air out fast," he said, "and get it acidic fast, and it keeps for months. Leave air pockets, or pack it too loose, or let it sit too long before covering it, and you get exactly what she'd smelled behind her barn." Her second attempt was better and still a failure, just a different one. She rented a bagger, a machine that packs silage into long white plastic tubes, a common enough piece of equipment in the valley for corn silage, and ran a load of pulp through it in November. But she hadn't accounted for the pulp's moisture content properly. Wet beet pulp, fresh from the diffuser, can run 88 to 92% moisture, wetter than most silage crops, and she'd packed it at that moisture level without adding anything to help. The bag held its shape, seemed fine for the first month, but by January when she opened it, the bottom third had gone anaerobic in the wrong way anyway, soupy and foul, because the sheer weight of that much water had let it slump and pool at low points in the bag, creating pockets where the plastic had stretched and let in tiny amounts of oxygen at the seams. Elmer's comment, when she told him, "Pack it too wet, it finds its own way to ruin itself. You want it packed like you're mad at it." She didn't fully get that one until later either. The third failure was about scale, not spoilage. By her second full season doing this, word had gotten around that she was hauling pulp for free, and it was actually working. Gary Iverson had asked to buy 15 tons off her that first winter, after seeing her cows looking fat and glossy through a hard February, and she'd sold it to him at a modest markup over her hauling cost. Her first sale, almost an accident, barely profitable once she counted her own diesel and time. That went well enough that word spread further, and by the third fall 3 more small dairymen wanted pulp from her, not straight from the plant. She said yes to all of them without doing the number of tons that meant, and found herself desperately short of bagging capacity in November, pulp piling up loose again, waiting its turn at the bagger, some of it going bad exactly the old way before she could get to it. She'd underestimated how much storage and equipment mattered at any scale beyond her own herd. That failure cost her close to 9 tons of spoiled product, and worse, one annoyed customer who didn't come back that year because the load she finally delivered him was inconsistent, some good silage, some borderline. A dairy that's used to consistent commercial feed will not tolerate a load that changes quality bag to bag. That inconsistency lost her the account for a full season, and it stung more than the money, because it taught her that this couldn't be a hobby anymore. It needed a real system, enough bagging capacity, a schedule, and quality checks. She started using simple pH paper on finished silage, looking for a reading around 4.0 to 4.2, which told her the lactic fermentation had done its job, before she'd sell a single ton. The fourth failure was pure bad luck, or so it seemed at first. A hard freeze in December of her third year hit a batch of pulp that was still sitting in the bagger's holding pit, unbagged, waiting on a mechanical repair. Frozen wet pulp doesn't ensile properly once it thaws. The freeze-thaw cycle ruptures the plant cells and changes the sugar availability, and the fermentation that follows tends to run hot and fast and produce more butyric acid than a clean batch would, because the good lactic bacteria don't get the head start they need. She lost that batch too, about 6 tons, and it taught her the last piece: timing. Beet pulp needed to move from the plant to the bagger to sealed storage within days, not weeks, and definitely not across a freeze. After that, she stopped taking deliveries she couldn't process within 48 hours, no matter how good the price of free felt. Elmer Sandvold died the following spring, in April, at 80. Mari went to the funeral, and at the lunch after, in the church basement, his daughter gave her an old spiral notebook of his, feed formulations, and notes from his mill days, because Elmer had told her before he died that the Beet girl might use it more than anybody. In the notebook, on a page about silage additives, Mari found a line in his cramped handwriting: "Pack it like you're mad at it. Every pound, every layer, no mercy, no air." She'd heard him say it once, standing by the bagger, and hadn't understood it as anything but a strange turn of phrase. Reading it now, having lost 3 batches to exactly the kind of loose, incomplete packing that phrase warned against, she understood it as the whole trade in 6 words: density is everything, because density is what excludes the oxygen that ruins everything else. It landed the second time the way it hadn't the first. By then, her operation had grown past what she'd ever have called a business plan. It had grown the way these things actually grow, one working step at a time, each one only possible because the last one had held. The accidental sale to Gary Iverson in year 1 had shown her there was demand beyond her own herd. That led her, in year 2, to start showing up at the informal livestock auction barn in Cavalier on sale days with a few totes of finished silage in the back of her truck, selling by word of mouth to small dairy and beef operations who'd smelled Gary's cows doing well and wanted to know his secret. By year 3, with the bagging system finally sized right, she'd bought her own used bagger outright with a small equipment loan rather than renting one every fall, which let her control her own schedule instead of waiting on a rental company during the 6-week window when pulp was actually available. She landed her first real account. A 110-cow dairy near Halleck, Minnesota, 20 minutes across the river, that signed on for a full winter's supply, about 200 tons, delivered in stages from October through March. That was the point where she had to stop thinking of herself as someone with a side hustle and start thinking of herself as someone running a feed business. The Halleck account mattered because it was the first time a buyer had come to her instead of the reverse, and it forced her to formalize things she'd been doing casually: a standard moisture target, a standard pH check on every batch before it left her yard, a delivery schedule instead of a "call me when you need some" arrangement. It also exposed her to her first real cost shock. In her 4th year, plastic tubing for the bagger, a petroleum product, jumped in price by almost 40% inside a single season, part of a broader spike in plastic film costs, and she'd priced her contracts before that happened. She ate the difference that year, rather than break a contract, which cost her real money, but bought her something worth more: a reputation, in a small farming community where reputation is the only currency that compounds, for being the supplier who didn't flinch and didn't shortchange anybody when things got expensive. By year 5, she had wholesale relationships with 2 other dairies and a small feedlot near Grafton, and she'd hired her first part-time hand, a 19-year-old named Cole Restad, to help run the bagger during the 6-week harvest window when the plant was producing pulp faster than any one person could move it. She'd also, by then, negotiated something the plant itself hadn't offered anyone before. Instead of hauling pulp for free on a first-come basis like everyone else, she signed an actual standing agreement with the Drayton plant's byproducts manager, who by this point had watched her haul consistent volume for 5 straight campaigns without ever leaving a mess behind or overloading the scale house line. The agreement gave her guaranteed first access to a set daily tonnage during the campaign, with the plant even letting her stage her bagger right at their yard for 2 weeks each fall instead of trucking pulp home first, cutting her transport costs by more than half since she was no longer hauling 90% water any farther than she had to. The plant that once posted a sign begging anyone to take pulp away for free now had a woman with a contract, and the byproducts manager, a quiet man named Dale Rustad who'd inherited the problem of pulp disposal from his predecessor, told a Farm Journal reporter a few years later that Mari Halverson had solved a headache we didn't think was solvable and made money doing it, which is more than we ever managed. The doubters came around the way they usually do in a small place, slowly, without much ceremony, mostly by simply stopping their doubting out loud. Gary Iverson, her first customer, became something closer to a business partner, buying pulp silage from her every winter and occasionally helping her cover deliveries when Cole was in school. Her father's old banker, who had quietly expected her to sell the herd within a year of the funeral, approved a second equipment loan in her 6th year, this one for a second bagger and a small concrete bunker pad so she could store more volume on site and stop being limited by how fast one machine could pack pulp during the 6-week rush, without asking her to bring in a cosigner, which in that town was its own kind of vote of confidence. The economics, by year 7, looked like this, roughly. She was moving close to 1,100 tons of finished beet pulp silage a season, sourced essentially for free, from the plant, apart from a modest access fee she now paid Drayton as part of their standing agreement, with her real costs concentrated in trucking, plastic tubing, fuel for the bagger, and labor. She sold finished silage by the ton, delivered at a price that undercut what any of her customers would have paid for equivalent tonnage of corn silage or hay, while offering better fiber digestibility for lactating dairy cows than plain corn stalks. Her own herd, still around 40 head, cost less to feed than it had a decade earlier, even accounting for inflation on everything else, because roughly a third of her winter ration by weight was now pulp silage that had cost her almost nothing but labor and plastic. None of it would have worked without the specific, boring, technical things she'd been forced to learn the hard way. That fresh, wet pulp needed to move into anaerobic storage within about 2 days of leaving the diffuser, or its sugars would already be feeding the wrong microbes. That packing density, not additives, was the single biggest factor separating good silage from a slimy, spoiled mess, because density excluded oxygen, and oxygen was the enemy of the whole process. That a pH reading in the low 4s meant the lactic acid bacteria had won the race, and the batch was stable, while anything above about 4.5 meant trouble was likely already brewing, even if it didn't smell like it yet. That freeze-thaw cycles before ensiling ruined the plant structure and skewed the fermentation toward butyric spoilage, no matter how well you packed afterward. And that customers who dairy farm for a living will forgive almost anything except a load that isn't the same quality as the last one, because their whole operation runs on predictable ratios, and unpredictable feed means unpredictable milk. She still keeps Elmer Sandvold's notebook in the cab of her truck, the pages soft and curled at the corners now, and she still tells new customers, when they ask how she keeps her silage so consistent, that the secret isn't a secret at all. It's just packing every load like you're mad at it, no mercy, no air, and watches most of them nod politely without quite understanding, the way she once didn't, until the day they open a bag themselves and it's exactly right. The mountain behind the Drayton plant is still there every fall, steaming in the October air, but it doesn't sit for 6 weeks anymore, and there's no hand-lettered sign begging people to take it away. There's a schedule now, and a woman with 2 baggers and a hired hand and a line of customers waiting on her calendar, turning what an entire sugar plant once called worthless into the thing that keeps 40, then 80, then well over 100 cows fed through the hardest months of a Red River Valley winter, and turning a 26-year-old who once thought she was 8 months from losing everything into the person every dairy in 3 counties eventually had to call if they wanted pulp silage done right. There is a particular morning worth describing in full, because it shows better than any summary how far the operation had come from those first 3 loads hauled home in a borrowed dump trailer. It was a Tuesday in late October, 7 years and 1 season after that first hard freeze had cost her 6 tons and taught her the value of timing. The campaign was 3 weeks in. Mari arrived at the Drayton plant yard just after 5 in the morning, when the sky was still the color of skim milk and the diffusers inside the plant were running loud enough to hear from the parking lot. Cole Restad, now 26 himself, married, with a kid on the way, backed the second bagger into position without being told where to put it, because by then, he'd done it enough seasons that the geometry of the yard was just something in his hands. Dale Rustad, the byproducts manager, came out with a clipboard, and the two of them talked for maybe 90 seconds about tonnage. The plant was slicing beets faster than usual that week because a warm September had pushed sugar content up, and the plant wanted to process before a forecasted freeze, which meant more pulp than average was coming off the diffusers, and Mari needed to know that before she committed her day's capacity. This was the kind of decision that never showed up in the early years, because in the early years, there was no capacity to allocate. There was just whatever she could shovel into whatever container she had. Now she had 2 baggers, a standing agreement, a delivery calendar with 4 accounts on it, and a decision to make about whether to run both machines at once, which meant pulling Cole off the second bagger to help load, or whether to bring on the extra part-time man she'd started hiring during peak weeks, a retired mechanic named Ansel Thorvald, who worked 3 afternoons a week, mostly because he liked the noise and the company. She called Ansel. He came in by 7. By 9 that morning they had 600 feet of white plastic tube lying across the gravel like a sleeping animal, slowly swelling as pulp packed in behind the bagger's rotor. And the smell, still sour, still faintly sweet, a smell she'd stopped noticing as anything but work, hung over the whole yard. She checked the moisture on that morning's pulp with a quick squeeze test, an old trick Elmer had shown her before he died. Grab a handful, squeeze hard, and read what happens. If water runs freely between your fingers in a stream, it's too wet to pack well without some adjustment. If it just beads and clings, you're in the right range. That morning's batch beaded. Good. She'd also started, in her 5th year, blending in a small percentage of dry corn stover with especially wet pulp lots, cutting the moisture down a few points and giving the mass slightly more structure, which helped the packing density Elmer had always preached about. It wasn't a trick from any of the old notebooks, it was hers, learned from watching which of her own batches came out tightest. By early afternoon, the first bag of the day was sealed, both ends tied off and staked, sitting fat and pale in the yard like an enormous grub, dated in marker on the plastic, a habit she'd started after the Halleck account taught her the value of knowing exactly how old any given bag was before she sold from it. Cole labeled it 1024, lot 118. She had kept a lot number on every batch since her 6th season, after a minor scare with one dairy that called worried about a slight color difference in one delivery. Nothing had actually been wrong. The color difference was just from a slightly different sugar content in that particular run of beets, but the call had reminded her that a business built on trust needed paperwork behind the trust, not just her word. Around 3 in the afternoon, a truck she didn't recognize pulled into the plant yard and parked near the scale house. A man in a canvas coat got out and stood looking at the bagging operation for a while before he came over. He introduced himself as Hollis Egg, from a 200-cow operation out past Osnabrück, and said he'd heard about her from a nutritionist who consulted for 3 different valley dairies, who'd apparently told him, matter-of-factly, that the Halverson pulp silage runs more consistent than most commercial byproduct feeds you can buy, bagged from a distributor. Hollis wanted to know if she had capacity for a new account, 200 cows, delivered every 3 weeks through the winter. She did the math out loud with him right there in the yard, the way she'd learned to do over years of these conversations. Tonnage per delivery, moisture target, price per ton delivered versus his current corn silage cost. which had gone up again that year with fuel and fertilizer prices still elevated from years before. It worked out, on paper, to a savings for him of around $18 a ton over what he was currently paying for supplemental fiber, with comparable or slightly better energy value for his lactating cows. He shook her hand on it standing in the gravel. No lawyer, no formal contract yet. That would come later, drawn up the way all her larger accounts eventually were, with tonnage minimums and a moisture and pH spec written into it. But the handshake was the real agreement, in the way handshakes still mostly were in that part of the world. That night, driving home past her own barn with the parlor lights already on for evening milking, she thought about the sign that used to hang by the Drayton Scale house. Free, take all you want. Long gone now, taken down sometime in her 4th or 5th year, once the plant stopped needing to beg. She thought about the smell of that first rotted pile behind her father's barn, and the vet's bill, and Elmer's quiet voice telling her she wasn't storing pulp, she was making silage, a distinction that had taken her 2 ruined batches to actually understand in her hands, rather than just in her head. She was 33 now. The dairy herd had grown modestly, to about 60 head, mostly because the pulp silage business had stabilized her cash flow enough that she could stop treating the cows as the only thing standing between her and the bank. But the real growth had happened in the silage operation itself. 2 baggers, a concrete pad, a standing agreement with a sugar plant that once couldn't give its own byproduct away, 4 steady wholesale accounts, and a rotating handful of smaller buyers at the Cavalier auction barn, and a reputation, finally, that had outgrown the county. A trade magazine had written a short piece on her operation 2 winters back, more curious than admiring, framing it as a novelty, woman turns factory waste into feed empire, which made her laugh, because there was no empire, just a woman with 2 machines, 1 part-time mechanic, 1 former factory worker's kid, and a very precise understanding of moisture percentages and fermentation chemistry that had cost her, all told, maybe 15 tons of ruined pulp and 1 lost account to learn properly. Her father's old dairy still stood on the same ground, the barn repainted but the same footprint, the same low horizon out every window flat enough to see weather coming from 20 miles off. Elmer Sandvold's notebook still rode in the truck, tucked behind the seat, its cover soft as cloth now from being handled so many falls in a row. And every October, when the trucks started rolling into Drayton loaded with beets, and the diffusers started their long, hot hum, and the first wet, sweet-smelling load came off the line and got dumped where the mountain used to grow, Mari Halverson was there before 5 in the morning to make sure it never got the chance to become a mountain again, because somewhere along the way, without ever quite deciding to, she had become the reason a sugar plant's biggest headache turned, every single year, straight into somebody's paycheck instead.